Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us. Hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Duke Rohlen of Ajax. Duke, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Great. So how did you get into the early stage world?
So I've been in this space for about 15, maybe 17 years. I started in it because I was very interested in the interplay between innovation and technology and people, healthcare. And I thought this was an interesting and an appropriate way to merge two areas of interest and import in my life. So I started originally at a small company called Lumen, which was a device to help people with peripheral vascular disease. We ended up selling that company to J&J. And I joined a company called Fox Hollow, which grew to be sort of the major player in peripheral vascular space. We ended up selling that company to EV3, which then was sold to Covidien, and then obviously was sold to Medtronic. Then I started a company called CV Ingenuity, which is a drug device company for peripheral vascular disease. We ended up selling that company to Covidien, which then sold to Medtronic. I did a company called Spyrox, which I started, and we sold that company to Intellis, which was then sold to Stryker. And now I'm running Ajax. So I've been in this space a long time. I've seen tremendous change go on, both on the innovation side and on the funding side. And I think it's a really germane opportunity and time to speak about those changes.
So what are the trends in the medical device space? You've got many years of experience in many companies under your belt, so you probably have seen quite a bit come. But what are the current trends that you're seeing today?
So I would say that there are two basic categories. One is on the innovation side, and one is on the strategic side. On the strategic side, which I'll start with first, there has been an increasing need to create companies that are driving towards profitability, that have standalone viability, and that are not beholden to capital that's just going to get them from financing to financing, but rather is going to get them all the way to being a standalone company. That's changed dramatically since I started. Fox Hollow was a company that was a single product company, had a big sales force, was selling product into hospitals. The physicians that were in those hospitals were driving the decisions. Fast forward to today, single product companies are very, very challenged because they don't have the call point leverage by having other products that they can sell in addition to their product. And the decision-making process of hospitals has changed from the physician having unassailable impact on what products are used to now the C-suite driving what's being used. So there's been strategic changes, and business models have had to adapt in order to create paths that allow them to go from concept all the way through to commercial viability, and therefore to strategic and financial returns. On the operating side and on the innovation side, we're seeing tremendous changes going on in the space. You're seeing software, which is becoming more and more common in the technologies. The software is becoming more complex. Data is being gathered from the software, is being organized, and is working to dramatically change and improve outcomes. I see that in the electrophysiology space, where we've taken a catheter that is not, it's very basic, right? That has a lot of very basic capabilities, and we've empowered that catheter with a state-of-the-art high processing generator that can evaluate tissue and catheter tip interfaces at data points at 4,000 times per second. So with that very, very real information, you're able to adjust and modify treatment. The net result of that in that catheter specifically has been we've been able to reduce procedure times by 50, 60%. So if you think about that in sort of a microcosm of what's going on holistically, you're seeing massive, massive trends towards data analysis and data analysis to drive not only therapy at the time, but to come up with sort of almost AI level predictors of what's going to work and what's not going to work by harnessing that information to develop new treatments and capabilities that are going to improve efficacy. You've also seen this massive influx of new players into the space. The big non-medical device players like Amazon, their agreement with Chase, Amazon, you've got Facebook, you've got Google, you've got all these companies that look at the challenges that are faced by healthcare and wanting to take cost out of that system that are now beginning to direct expertise and technology and capital to develop products that are used in this medical device space. I think the biggest area that we're going to see in terms of optimization is the focus on technology specifically being designed based on the human factor needs. And by that, I mean, how do you develop technologies so they can reduce and or eliminate all human error, right? How can you make them faster, easier to use, such that the training required to be able to treat patients is lower and user compatibility is broader, meaning the physicians aren't the only people that can use it, but maybe nurse technicians are, et cetera. So I think you're going to see a trend there. And then finally, I would say that you're going to see trends in the regulatory pathway that changed, and de novo pathways, which has historically been very, very expensive and timely and take an enormous amount of time to get through, are going to become more like some of the predicate-based 510K pathways, which will expose an enormous amount of opportunity for technologies that otherwise wouldn't get funded to go all the way through that long regulatory path. So a lot of change going on, both on the strategic side as well as on the innovation side.
There's a lot of new trends here, bringing new technologies to the market, and we have investors who listen to the show that are always trying to figure out how best to invest in different sectors. What would you say about how best to invest in the medical device sector? What should they be looking for, and what should they be considering?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are three basic categories of capability that any investment in the healthcare medtech device space needs to have. One is the technology, right? And the technology has to be there. It has to focus on improving speed, improving simplicity, having objective data efficacy that will drive treatment utilization. And then critically now, more than ever, it's got to have a cost component. And the cost component can be broken down as either reducing costs for the hospital and therefore being utilized, and or having strong reimbursement so that even though the cost isn't potentially being reduced, the reimbursement supports its utilization. That reimbursement is driven by efficacy. So if you're not looking at speed and then efficacy, simplicity, and cost, from an innovation side, you're going to have very, very significant challenges in terms of getting value out of that investment. Secondly, I think that the model has changed, right? The model used to be you build these little technologies to the point where a big strategic like a Medtronic or a J&J or a Boston Scientific or an Abbott is willing to step in. However, there's been massive consolidation within the large acquirers. St. Jude was bought by Abbott. Medtronic acquired Covidien. So the number of acquirers has gone down. Those acquirers are also dealing with massive amounts of debt that they care about from an earnings per share standpoint. So buying companies before they're accretive becomes increasingly challenging. So from a medical device investment space, I think you have to take a much longer term horizon. Instead of saying, okay, I can build this to sell, now you have to go back to the concept of building to last. And then when you look at a build to last company, all of the metrics that drive towards profitability, the traditional business models of companies that are highly valued, have to be there, right? You have to be able to make money. You have to have sustainability. You can't be hemorrhaging cash as you work towards or as you hope to try and get acquired by some strategic because they can't acquire you because you're non-accretive, and B, there are fewer buyers out there that are willing to step in early. So it's a completely different landscape, and I think it's a complex landscape. You have to be very informed about the target investment you're making and understand not only their short-term drivers of value creation, but their longer-term and drivers, and make sure that those actually exist.
So cost control is really a key factor in all of healthcare and in particular medical devices. And my question is, what level of cost reduction does a startup need to bring to the table to really get attention and really get funding? What level of cost reduction? And the other point some people brought up is you have to truly reduce the cost, not just shift it to somebody else in the system, because ultimately the system will have to pay for that. But what level of cost reduction you think someone has to set as a bar to say, if I get to that point, I'm going to get people's attention on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think cost reduction is, like I said earlier, it's one of the four pillars of success, right? Speed, simplicity, efficacy, which is a major driver of utilization and cost. Without all four of those components being addressed, I think you have the ability to predict failure, to be honest with you. I think you need to be able to articulate with data how costs can be reduced, but also speed can be enhanced, simplicity is optimized, and efficacy is there. So I think all of those capabilities are required in order for costs to be reduced. I would also say that the old model, right? So there's this sort of an old model of investing in medical device technologies, and then there's the new model. The old model is you build up this infrastructure, you spend a lot of money, you get the thing to the point where all is required to do is to run a clinical trial to get it approved, and then you've got this very, very significant market disruptor of a technology. That model hasn't worked for the most part. It's worked sometimes, but it's not worked the majority of times. And so the big acquirers have become a little bit more disciplined about saying, hey, listen, we're not going to take on the costs associated with running those trials. We want demonstrated proof. What does that mean? That means the timeline is longer and the costs are higher. So in order to get demonstrated proof of the technology, you have to be able to get it to a point where there is verifiable data that supports its benefit earlier and for less money. And so to me, that comes down to a business model. How do you take an idea and reduce its risks from a development standpoint, reduce its risk from a reimbursement standpoint, reduce its risk from a timeline standpoint, and probably most fundamentally, reduce its risk from a market acceptance standpoint? How can you know that the market's going to accept it? How can you do all of that with $10 or $15 million max? And if you can verifiably validate that a technology is going to have big market share if and when it gets approved, then you've taken one of the critical decisions out of the assessment algorithm, which is, if I get this approved, will the field of dreams, if I build it, will they come? You want to basically know that if I make this work, it will be sold. And you have to be able to do that on a very, very shoestring budget. So you have to have very strong teams of small, very, very high profile and high octane producers who can go into a company and drive in a very capital efficient way to a data point that suggests that, yes, if I build this, people will buy it. And then once you have that information, once you know that the technology can get approved, that the technology is going to be de-risked enough that it's going to work in humans, and you have some data that you feel very strongly about from the market that the technology will be adopted, then you back up the truck. You spend a lot of money and you make sure that you can get it all the way to regulatory approval. So it's a two-phased approach. First, you validate, then you spend the money to develop and mature the organization. If you do the developing and maturing the organization before you validated the technology, again, I think it's a very, very challenged business model.
So there's clinical trials that people have to go through, clinical 1, 2, 3, et cetera, to prove efficacy and prove, it works and that type of thing. The question is, in the tech world, people use revenue to prove that things are working well. If customers are buying it, then it must be a good thing. In the medical device world, because there's really no revenue metrics going in there, really all you have is clinical data and other trials. How do you look at that data and really assess that even with limited resources, they're getting a good result versus they don't have enough resources to make a really good determination? How does an investor analyze that medical device data to say, yep, they're now achieving that goal of efficacy and cost reduction that you're bringing up?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think there are a couple dimensions there. One is there are regulatory governors, right, that say hey, listen, you've got to run this study. You've got to compare it to this standard of care. In order for you to get approved, you're going to have to be as good, if not, you can't be worse. Maybe you need to be as good, or maybe you need to get better, depending on which technology you're dealing with. However, that's the regulatory piece of the puzzle. That's not the market driver. What the regulatory system looks for is this technology safe and effective? It doesn't look at, is this technology going to be adopted by the marketplace? And that's an important distinction for investors. They have to say, just because the FDA is required that this company does some big level 1 study, which has 400 randomized patients and gets approved, that doesn't mean the technology is going to work, okay? Or that the technology is going to be adopted. So that's where I think the creativity comes in. And the creativity has to come in early before you do that 4, 5, 800 person study, which at $20,000 a pop is somewhere between 800 or $8 million and $20 million of study, right? It's an enormously expensive study. So my whole approach, and we did this at one of my companies, Spirox, is before we even went to the market, I hired 2 guys, and they were very, very high-level guys, to go out into the marketplace and meet with 200 different physicians, explain the technology, explain what we were doing, and understand, okay, if this technology, given that it had reimbursement and given that it was doing X, Y, and Z, were to come to market, would you use it? And 2 things came out of that approach. One is we were able to gather very, very significant information about individual physicians, what they liked, what they didn't like, et cetera. 2, we were able to understand that if those physicians that said it, and it was like a very, very high responder rate, 90+% said they would use it at least 2 times a month. We were able to then develop a very, very predictive financial model based on that. And the third thing, we were then able to go back to those physicians and hold them accountable. Once we got it approved, we were able to say, hey, listen, you guys said you would use this 2 or 3 times a month. Now let's say you do that. With that information, we were then able to go to investors and say, hey, listen, we've sort of solved the puzzle. Yes, there's regulatory risk that we need to get through. Yes, the technology needs to work. But if you can get through the regulatory pathway, and if you have the technology yield on the other side of the regulatory pathway, we have confidence based on very, very primary diligence that we can sell this into the marketplace. That enabled us to raise an enormous amount of money from very, very smart investors like KKR who came into that deal.
So how did you hold the physicians accountable? Because many a customer or prospective customer says, yeah, I'll use that product. And then when you go back to them later, their mind has changed or the budget went elsewhere. How were you able to go back to the physicians who told you, yeah, we'll buy this if you make it, and actually bring that all the way through?
It's a really good point. And I think this point transcends business and goes back to human nature, right? You can't hold anybody accountable. What you can hold them accountable to is a relationship with you or with the person that is accountable. Nobody wants to, in just life, nobody, except for maybe for people in our government, nobody really wants to be caught in a lie or have said something that they're not going to live up to. And there's a very subtle interpersonal contract that comes from that level of accountability. And so my whole approach was, hey, listen, you can't go to physicians one time and say, hey, you're going to use this. And then they say yes or no. You got to get a relationship going. So we had 200 plus relationships with physicians, not 1, not 10, 200 relationships where we knew those physicians. We knew them well. We knew about their families. They knew about our families. They knew about our company. They were brought into the fold, and we brought them into our organization. And based on that, we got to know them. We involved them in the process of the development. We were able to understand from them that, yes, they would use it. And then based on the relationship, which was not a one-meeting relationship, we sort of were able to hold them more accountable. And you know what? It worked. So I think this is an example of how healthcare or technology or innovation, it all goes back to a basic contract between people. That doesn't need to be a written contract. It's a relationship thing. And that's what business really is. That's what healthcare is. It's like helping patients. Business is getting to a constructive endpoint between 2 people. That's what That's what we were able to do. There's no accountability. It's more of a personal responsibility to uphold what you said you would do. And they knew how important that responsibility and what they had said was to our company, and they honored it.
Well, that's a very good point. Well, in the last few minutes we have here today, what else should we cover that we haven't so far?
I think we've covered a lot. I think that the one thing I would say is that the healthcare space is probably one of the ripest opportunities for investment, primarily because it's changing so dramatically. You have systemic changes in terms of how technologies are getting to market. You see the regulatory pathways being changed. You have new entrants coming in that have an enormous amount of capital. And you have a tailwind, which is the overall healthcare growth and spend from a GDP standpoint that's not going away, right? To be smart about investing in that space creates opportunity. And whenever there's change going on, there's significant opportunities to capitalize on investment. And I think there's dramatic systemic change going on within our healthcare organization. I think it's going to be, 10 years from now, you're going to see a much healthier and quite frankly, a different profiled healthcare ecosystem. And between now and then, being able to invest in that, I think, is going to create enormous value for the people that can choose those investments wisely.
That's also a good point. So how best for the audience to get back in touch with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Duke Rohlen, Rohlen. My name is pronounced Rohlen. And then also D. Rohlen at ajaxhealth.com, which is my email. Those are the best ways to reach me.
All right. We'll put those in the show notes so people can get back in touch with you, and love to have you back in a follow-on to dive deeper into these topics, as I think we're just scratching the surface of a very important area for us, given the cost of healthcare and the technological changes going on in it. There's quite a bit of investment dollars flowing around now and even more coming into it, and looking forward to learning more about how one could invest in these spaces.
Terrific. I'd love to. Thank you very much for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.